Hey, what's up guys? This is Vincenzo from Vincenzo Pro Photography here with another video. Today I'm unboxing my new camera, the Panasonic G9II, and going over my top picks for beginner pro photographers, filmmakers, and micro four thirds shooters in 2024. I'm also doing a size comparison between the Lumix G9 Mark II and my current camera, the Lumix G7. I decided to upgrade my camera. All of the work I did was done on my Lumix G7, my first real camera. The reason I got the Lumix G7, and the reason I think most people get a Lumix, is because they really wanted a Sony but couldn't afford it or just didn't want to pay for it. This time is a little bit different because at this point Lumix is doing something unique here. I would say from 2014, which is when Sony came out with the A7, S, and R, until right about now is where their influence is either outplayed or greatly felt, because somewhere along the way other camera brands started making serious mirrorless body entries, and Lumix has always had a niche for making people smile with their price tags and their capabilities for their price tags. This is the Lumix G9 Mark II next to my old G7 or G70 for side-by-side comparison.
Riddick on the track.
When I got my G7, I originally wanted the A6300 at the time and saw the G7 as a great step towards my goal of an A6300. However, as time went on and I learned more about cameras, film creation, and the type of images I've always wanted to create, I realized for the images I wanted to create, I would need something more like an FX6, Arri Alexa, Sony Venice 2, or Burano 8K, not an A6300, which, don't get me wrong, I still think of it as the ultimate run and gun system, but I learned it just isn't capable of creating the images I wanted. That brings us to my top picks. My top picks are a compilation of the most important specifications from all the cameras I was researching to be my next camera. I knew going in working with my G7 that it was not going to create the exact images that I wanted, though it would get me very close to it. And I took the time I spent using the G7 to learn exactly what areas needed to be polished to get the vision I wanted to see in my photos and videos. This way I would know exactly what I needed whenever the opportunity presented itself to upgrade. Going from one camera to the next also presented the possibility of having to get rid of my lens collection, and I was willing to do so if it meant getting the images I've always wanted. Budget for me was based on how close I could get my image to my vision and how much money I felt comfortable investing to maximize profit in my business with my capabilities, pricing, and market. Again, I was hoping for a Sony. Sony seems to be my standard. A Sony A7S Mark III on the video side and an A7 Mark IV on the photo side. My criteria for a new camera was supposed to build up from my current camera and compete with whatever gear other creators had that was making them maximum profits. I want to briefly go over the things that I've learned that were necessary to create the images I like to see and have become my criteria for finding my next camera. There's 7 different points. Number 1, micro four thirds sensors have more challenges than full frame sensors to capture light to make images, so typically they are not the ideal pick for still photo photographers of any kind. Though they do have some advantages that go unseen for their more obvious disadvantages, Panasonic has been dedicated to making the tide change in that area. Number 2, Panasonic cameras, including the G7, have never had a reliable autofocus system for content creators nor professional field users until the S5 line of full-frame mirrorless cameras. Number 3, in-body image sensor stabilization and digital image stabilization on multiple levels has been in lots of different cameras, though not the G7. Both make a difference performance in photos and in videos. It is not a replacement for a gimbal, but it has been making a lot of improvements over the years. 4. Dynamic range is what's responsible for giving content creators, specifically Photoshop, Lightroom, DaVinci Resolve, photo, video editors, and color graders, the freedom in JPEGs, RAWs, and film logs to change and manipulate images into masterpieces. The higher a camera's dynamic range rating, the more creators can modify images while still maintaining their quality and details. The G7 has a reliable DR, or dynamic range rating, of 10 plus in numeric stops. Number 5 is video depth. Bit depth of video determines the rating of digital color information detention in video formats. The higher the rating, the more color and light information can be stored in your videos, and the more your video can be graded without losing details. Like many cameras, the Lumix G7 only captures 8-bit video color depth, which is not considered impressive. 8-bit color depth and 14-bit color depth for photos. Number 6, video frame rates are extremely important to content creators, as frame rate is notoriously dictated by which resolution they are taken in and the challenges of using each recording resolution. The higher the frame rate of video, the more creative slow motion effects are possible for that resolution. The G7 takes an impressive 4K video resolution, but only at an underwhelming 24 and 30 frames per second, which is limiting in terms of creativity for slow motion. Number 7, megapixels aren't everything, and more is not necessarily better, as satisfaction depends on the crowd of the camera's target user. Video-centric cameras will have 8 to 16 megapixels, and photocentric cameras will have more like 24 to 60 megapixels. The Lumix G7 captures up to 16 megapixel stills, which is fine as long as you're not making giant prints, but it does have less than standardized professionally expected details in its raw images for editing. The camera also never featured any technology to help boost its effectiveness, such as pixel shift, to subsequent its shortage of megapixels. All of those aspects put together, the effort put into the G7 still makes a good deal for only $600 MSRP, and now available for only $450 body only. From what I learned about my camera and for what I wanted after I learned about my camera, my standards for having a new A cam shifted. My G7 was a micro four thirds M mount autofocus, no internal or digital stabilization, 10 plus stops of dynamic range, 8-bit 4K 30, 8-bit HD 60, 16 megapixel camera for $550 USD. Still sticking with mirrorless and a few other specs that aren't important because they're not changing. I now wanted a camera with a full frame sensor, whichever mount or lenses would come with that, good autofocus, internal and or digital image stabilization, 12 plus stops of dynamic range, 10-bit HD video recording, 10-bit HD video recording at up to 120 frames per second, and at least 24 megapixels for stills. I was about to settle on my favorite Sony A7 Mark IV, which seemed to have a good combination of all of the things that I wanted, but I wasn't sure I wanted to pay all that money. I also didn't really want to spend that much on an A7S Mark III, which is the video killer side, because it was a lot of money for only 12 megapixels, even if it is still miles better than the Lumix G7 with its 16 megapixels, because it's full frame versus crop frame. Anyway, so I wanted to know if there was really absolutely no other camera out there that could shoot HD video in 10-bit at 120 frames per second, of at least 24 megapixels, good stabilization, good autofocus, and for a good price. I thought about the other newer camera bodies from Sony. I always knew about them, but I never really cared about getting into their specifications because they were very expensive and not a Sony Venice or an Arri Alexa, not really worth the expense. Even though they had all the latest technologies that even the Sony A7 series cameras don't have, and we're aiming for a streamlined run and gun workflow style body like the A6700, but with the capabilities of the A7 line cameras. I looked into those as well and was disappointed. The FX30 in particular did not have a lot of bang for the buck as an APS-C crop frame sensor camera. I was about to push the buy button on the Lumix GH6, but I was worried about the internal fan killing the battery and it being a lot of money for a camera with mediocre autofocus. Being that 4, 5, and 6K 4K video resolution were not on my priority list for my content creation goals, the GH5 Mark II was still an appealing option for me, especially for the price. Being able to shoot 10-bit HD at 180 frames per second and being available for less than $1,000, be it crop frame sensor, micro four thirds, 20 megapixels, and no reliable autofocus. I told myself, okay, let me check out the rest of the Lumix lineup and at least try to understand the S5, S5 Mark II, and S5 Mark II X situations, because previously I had not understood them or what the differences there were. I found out that they were being used as Sony A7 Mark IV and A7S Mark III killers for people on budgets. I really had no problem with them spec-wise, except that they were a little bit pricey, only 25 megapixels and full frame, meaning I would have to give up my lens collection and buy different lenses for additional cost. However, it was in learning about the S5 Mark II and S5 Mark II X that reviewers kept comparing them to the G9 Mark II and making references to a fiasco between Panasonic and its users of the GH6 and their then to be GH7 being what the GH6 was supposed to be all along, but instead was released early because of demand and consequently missing its new autofocus system, and that the less anticipated G9 Mark II came out with the finished version of that autofocus system that the GH6 was supposed to have. And in seeing how well this new autofocus system was working, it was creating an unexpected buzz around the camera. The G9 Mark II was supposed to be Panasonic's photocentric crop frame sensor camera, like flagship crop frame sensor camera. The stunning and confusing part is that as a photocentric camera, it has all of the video and autofocusing capabilities of the S5 line cameras and then some. Despite being a crop frame sensor camera, the difference between the S5 Mark II and S5 Mark II X and the G9 Mark II is that the G9 Mark II does not have an internal fan. The GH7 is Panasonic's video-centric crop frame flagship sensor camera and is actually the camera that I and many filmmakers prefer. The GH7 is the newer version of the GH6 and indeed brings back the internal fan. Seeing that the G9 Mark II and the GH7 share almost the exact same spec sheet, people will wonder if there's any differences at all besides how they look, but there are, including the fact that the GH7 has the internal fan, the expansion slot for CF express cards, video-centric button layout, body style for tripods, rigs, and cages, and consequently costs $300 more for the body alone. The chart highlights key differences between cameras and the reason each looks so appealing to beginner pros, both on the photo side and the video sides. I can bet that you will be hard-pressed to find better cameras anywhere else right now, realizing that the Lumix cameras had the best bang for the buck and the specs that met and surpassed my standards for a new A camera. I picked the G9 Mark II. Already owning the 14 to 42 millimeter f3.5 and 25 millimeter f1.7 mount lenses, the G9 Mark II was the closest to my standards for the price and my current lens collection. It also featured pixel shift to compensate for not competing with Sony's 33 megapixels and 300 frames per second to compete with the S5 Mark II and S5 Mark II X's 180 frames per second. For things that will be your bread and butter versus the extreme things that Sony can offer you, Lumix is making a statement worth looking into. That's it. That's the video. Thanks for watching, guys. Comment, like, and subscribe. Just want to rehash basically because I don't think I said everything that I needed to say, but one of the other reasons why I decided to jump into the G9 Mark II is also because when I was learning about the GH7, which is really the camera that I really want, it wasn't out yet. And then recently it became available on Amazon, but both cameras are practically identical, already surpassing my standards, but the difference is the price. I would have had to pay an extra $700 for that other camera. I plan on shooting in 1080p. I'm not really looking at overheating the system. I want to shoot 1080p 10-bit 120 frames per second. That's not really too much room to overheat the system. 4K 120, 4K 60, and 4K 120, that's when people really start overheating the system. And again, you know, if I shot that on an RE Alexa, it would look better than the 4K on some of these other cameras anyway. So it's $300, and then I didn't see it body only. I saw it body only recently and it was only like $2,100, but it's still $300 more than this camera. And I found this camera extra cheap too, so it would have been so much more money. So the factor of how much money I wanted to spend in order to be able to make it back out also goes into it. So I think I can really work well with this camera. I just want to see how things go, and I guess I'll keep you guys up to date on how things go and the type of content I'm able to make, and what I really like about the camera and what I don't like about the camera. But yeah, that's it for the video, guys. Comment, like, and subscribe. I'm gonna see y'all later. Peace.